William?
Hello, and thank you very much, Grace, for covering the first part of the presentation. So, as mentioned by Grace, we have taken an approach which focuses on what are the key things that are important for us and what needs to be protected. Hence, the focus on critical infrastructure and particular focus on critical information infrastructure. Next slide, please. Right. So how do we define critical infrastructure? So there is quite a deviation from different markets, countries, and groups on how critical infrastructure is defined. However, there are some common threads that we have studied basically when we were doing the report. And here are the four most common criteria in which a particular piece of infrastructure would be defined as critical. So the first one is, of course, size, right? If a particular piece of infrastructure affects, say, the whole country, then it is more critical than a piece of infrastructure that only affects a single person, right? So the geographical scope of a particular area, system, or sector is one of the key criteria in defining critical infrastructure. The second one is with respect to casualties. If the outage or the suppression of a particular piece of infrastructure would cause danger with respect to life and limb, then it could be considered critical as well. So, for example, if the availability of water were to be disrupted for an extended period of time, then it could affect a large number of people with respect to sickness and illness as well. The third is economic effects, so the significance of economic loss, and of course the unavailability of important products and services could also affect us, right? So the more an economic effect would affect the country, it also has a consequent effect of having an effect on the safety of people as well. So that's why economic effects tend to be a major factor and criteria as well. And of course, last but not the least, are public effects. So this basically are software effects that affect the public confidence, which will cause, for example, things like physical suffering and disruption of daily life or loss of essential services. So these are aspects normally provided by the government, right? And the unavailability of these services can cause disruption as well. Things like perception because of media, for example, if the lack of broadcast media and the lack of information with respect to a particular natural disaster can cause a disruption in public confidence, then that is something that affects public effects. And that particular piece of infrastructure, in this case, broadcast media, is defined as part of critical infrastructure. So these are the four main areas. And let's cover some examples. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yep. So here are some of the common themes we've seen in different countries. So we basically study the definition of CI from the United States, European Union, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, and of course our own. We have various definitions and various sectors that have been included as critical infrastructure. So first is government or public services, including emergency services. Of course, there's power and energy, which I think in the last, typhoon or that during the Christmas season, we've felt this particular disruption as well. There's also water, banking, and finance, right? So the outage of important clearinghouse systems can disrupt the move of money within the system. Of course, there's the communications, there's health and transportation. So these are some of the important sectors that are commonly defined amongst these countries. Next slide, please. In the Philippines, we do have an attempt at defining critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure. So, of course, in law, we have RA 10175, or the Cybercrime Prevention Act, that defines critical infrastructure in Section 2, letter J. We also have the Office of the President Memorandum Order 37, series of 2001, that covers important critical infrastructures in the light of terrorist activities. We have the DOE Department Order 2004 to 22, which basically covers critical infrastructure in the power and energy sector. Of course, importantly, National Cybersecurity Plan of 2022, which is being revised, also covers a definition of critical infrastructure, which is quite aligned with RA 10175. And we have the ICT Memorandum Circular number 5, which was released in August of 2007, that further clarifies the definition and protections for critical infrastructure that was defined as part of the National Cybersecurity Plan of 2022. Next slide, please. In our issuances and memorandum orders, here are the collation of areas that have been defined as critical infrastructure in the Philippines. So we have government or public sector, there's transportation, land, air, and sea, power and energy, water, health, emergency service and disaster response, banking and finance, telecommunications, media, and of course, unique to the Philippines, business process outsourcing. Next slide, please. So in our case, we do have some criteria as well. So it involves both public and private entities who own, operate, control, and maintain critical infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be a public entity, or it doesn't have to be specifically a private entity. There are many private entities in the Philippines that do operate critical infrastructure. We have two criteria in terms of size. So one is if it operates nationwide, like NGCP, for example, the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines, then it is automatically considered critical infrastructure. Or if it covers a major metropolitan area, so for example, Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, Metro Davao, and soon to be declared as a major metropolitan area, Metro Cagayan de Oro, are also parts of some parts of the definition in terms of size for critical infrastructure. Next slide, please. Of course, here are just some examples to give us a context, but not to preempt the report. So we will have the report will contain a lot more details with respect to the definition of critical infrastructure. But for example, in the case of energy, we have the Energy Regulatory Commission, and an example would be NGCP. In terms of water, we have the MWSS, and the major water concessionaires, Manila Water and Manila, for example, in the metropolitan Manila area. For banking and finance, we have the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, and the key critical information infrastructure here would be the clearing houses or the financial clearing houses that power services like Instanet and InstaPay and PesoNet that have been very, very important, particularly in this time of pandemic due to the increased adoption of digital payments and digital money transfers in the Philippines. So an outage of these clearinghouse platforms could cause a substantial disruption, for example, in the flow of commerce. Next slide, please. And of course, transportation. So you have the OT and the Civil Aviation Authority of the Philippines, the airlines, and the cargo operators are part of this. In telecommunications, the regulators, the National Telecommunications Commission, and the telecommunication companies themselves, which are generally national in scope, or at least they cover large metropolitan areas, would be some of the CIIs that covered under this. Broadcast media, we also have the National Telecommunications Commission that governed this area in terms of, at least in terms of radio spectrum, and the major broadcasters as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so that basically covers the definition of critical infrastructure. And as I said at the start of my presentation, we would like to focus on these areas because these are areas that have a significant impact in how we live. Critical information infrastructure are information systems that are prone to these types of attacks that we are seeing increase in this particular time. Now, here are some of the other recommendations, specific recommendations, outside protection of information infrastructure that we would like to cover. So first group of recommendations cover what we call the knowledge gap. So we have to create greater awareness of global and local cybersecurity. This is particularly important in this time because, as Grace mentioned a while ago, there is still this belief that we are not a target, right? Or we're too small, or we're not basically interesting enough for cyber threats to be of significance here in the Philippines. However, with the franchiseification, for example, of malware, anybody can actually take malware and buy it and actually run a particular attack. And this has become a lot more pervasive lately, particularly in time of pandemic when people are more tied in to technology or dependent on technology. That's why awareness is important and the acceptance that we are actually part of this threat landscape now. Okay. Next point. So we also need to generate and analyze local data. So a lot of the information we have right now are basically either global or regional in scope. So the ability to get local information, particularly at the sectoral level, so sector divides it into like financial, for example, or power or the utility sector, will allow us to will inform us better, and therefore we are now in a better position to create policies that address those gaps. Now, lack of information makes it difficult to create new policies or new actions in order for us to solve, for example, information security gaps and issues. And that's the reason why the one of the main activities we're doing as part of Secure Connections, as mentioned by Acting Secretary Ka in Intake, was basically to get a lay of the land, right? To do a study on the security posture of major public agencies. The third is to nurture an environment of cooperation and information sharing among not just local but also international communities. Again, because one person's incident can be another person's lesson. So far, we have been geographically blessed because normally cyber incidents, worms, for example, tend to spread in the Western markets first, which basically wake up first, then they get hit first, then it hits us later. However, that gap is closing, right? Again, with respect to the falsification of cyber malware and malware as a service, we actually are seeing attacks that are targeted to us directly. But it's still important to learn, right? So cyber threat analysis sharing is one of those important points as well. All right, next. So, and the second one is basically a policy gap. We strongly feel at Secure Connections that the adoption and enforcement of minimum information security standards to protect critical infrastructure and public institutions should be minimum policy recommendations. So we should set some baseline. Now, like a vaccine, for example, the minimum information security standards are not the cure-all, right? It will not solve all your health or cybersecurity issues, but at least it is a minimum baseline, and that is what we need at this point. We need some minimum protections. Now, a lot of these minimum information security standards are not too hard to implement. I mean, there are some that are more complicated, but they can be adapted based on a risk management framework. Different sectors have different levels of risk with respect to their information security infrastructure, and therefore they can adapt different standards that are applicable to their particular sector. So, for example, the banking and finance sector will take its cue from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas issuances at the local level, and at an international level, they have PCI, for example, that defines standards as well. But we strongly feel that the implementation and the enforcement of minimum information security standards must be in place. And the last gap we intend to address is, of course, the skills gap. Right? So like any new initiative, we require an army, right, to actually help us. So we need the skills, and we need to build up these skills. Cybersecurity is a job of all of us. It's not just the job of the ICT, or it's not just the job of the information security department in your organization or your company. Basically, cybersecurity culture or cybersecurity awareness is the job of everybody, right? And that's the reason why it is important that cybersecurity awareness be built at the general population level. But at the same time, we also need specialist skills in order to defend against increasing threats, information security threats. We also need a large group of cybersecurity professionals. Fortunately for us in the Philippines, we do have quite an IT-aware base and population, including a large number of IIT graduates that can serve as a pool for creating these cybersecurity professionals. So that's the last recommendation, that we actually build that as well. Right, so these are our key recommendations, and we are secure connections, as mentioned as part of the introduction video a while ago. In case you visit, walang ligtas kung hindi lahat ay ligtas. So thank you very much and have a good morning.